few years ago, DC Direct, in partnership with DC Collectibles, launched an experimental line of DC action figures. The line was conceived to compete with the popular Hasbro Marvel Legends figures and update the Mattel DC Universe offerings by enhancing the sculpt and articulation and paint apps on these figures. So why was it so experimental? Well, they tried something a little bit different, a little bit dangerous to differentiate the line from every other figure that was on the market at this time. So rather than opting for a 6-inch scale or going for the 7-inch scale, they tried something in between. And sadly, they opted for a 5-inch scale, which proved to be a pretty risky proposition because ultimately you are alienating fans who are collecting figures in 1 or 2 scales, and the predominant scales at this time were the 6 and 7-inch scales. So producing a new line of figures where collectors would have to invest in buying all of their favourite characters once again, but this time in a scale that's incompatible with their other figures, obviously rubbed fans the wrong way. As a result, there wasn't a lot of buy-in from fans for this line, and ultimately it proved to be very short-lived. Now, in hindsight, it's something of a shame because this line actually was pretty good. And so I thought it would be fun to revisit a couple of my favourites from this line, starting with Batman and Batgirl. So I'll start appropriately enough with Batman since he was the #1 release. He was the first release in this entire line. The packaging may look familiar to anyone who's picked up any of the other DC collectible figures from this time, including, say, the Batman Greg Capullo line, which used very similar packaging. Essentially, this is quite a clean looking oblong box. It's quite chunky for the size and scale of the figure inside. It is mostly window display, but what we have around the packaging is a lot of white space and very clean lines when it comes to the logos and text that is around it. But overall, this is pretty presentable. It looks quite clean, but on the other hand, it is a little bit bland, a little bit boring. That carries through to the side panel, which just has a number on it, so you can stack these up. We can see the bat symbol there, which is quite nice, and if you want to stack other figures in this line next to it, you will have a numbered collection and different logos on there, which is fine, but I think considering the amount of space we have here, it would have been nice if we had an illustration, some comic art, say, of that character. I do really quite like the back of the packaging. Again, it's very clean, lots of space here, and it's quite artistic in the way they've decided to show the other characters available in this initial wave, which is pretty colourful, quite fun. You can put this on display, and I think it looks pretty nice all in all. Okay, so once liberated from its packaging, yes, you will immediately notice that this is ever so slightly smaller scale than what we're used to. And yet, it seems barely noticeable in the sense that the articulation, the detailing and the paint apps all seem to be just perfectly applied. And before I go any further, I should point out that I've read that this is apparently meant to be a very specific version of Batman. It is in fact meant to be the Dick Grayson Batman, and there's been a couple of times during the long Batman history that Dick Grayson has taken the mantle of Batman, most recently during Grant Morrison's run just prior to the launch of the New 52, in which obviously Bruce Wayne would step back into the cape and cowl. But to be completely honest with you, I can't really tell this costume apart from the standard Batman costume. There's nothing that really gives this away as being specifically Dick Grayson to me. So for me, I'm quite happy to see this as the Bruce Wayne Batman, and I think this figure serves pretty well in that context. Now, all in all, I have to say I think the sculpting on this figure is excellent. Everything seems to be in proportion. There is a danger sometimes that characters like Batman in larger scales can look a little bit too beefed up, a little bit too big than he appears in comic books, but this seems to be pretty perfect, really. All the muscle groups seem to be tight and in proportion, but not overemphasized, not too big, just right. And I think the paint apps are very nicely applied. It's particularly on the belt there, on the utility belt. You can see a couple of different washes running through it. There's obviously a white wash running over that yellow to just give it a bit more authentic, a bit more lived-in feel, just looks a bit more real, which is great. And then there is a separate yellow gold on the buckle there, which really separates it apart and looks really very nice, I have to say. Now, the bat symbol is painted on rather than being sculpted, unfortunately, but the gauntlets you'll notice are a separate plastic piece, so there's definitely a sense of texture and depth here, which is nice. And the same is true of the boots as well. I personally really like this approach because it just feels a bit more authentic and a little bit more realistic, which is quite nice, instead of just being painted on or just sculpted slightly differently. This looks like those legs are actually in those boots, which is pretty cool. The cape is fine. It's nothing really to write home about. It is shaped in a nice sort of wavy line here. It's a little bit thin and narrow. You don't really get the sense that you could wrap this around him, which is a shame, but it is a very flexible rubber if nothing else. The articulation scheme is pretty much identical for both Batman and Batgirl, so I'll just run through it the ones here. Batman does have a ball joint in his head, so he can spin his head 360 degrees, he can look up, he can look down, although there is a tendency for the head to pop up quite easily, so it's something to be aware of, but nothing to complain about because it does pop back into place nice and securely, so there's no issues there. He does have ball joints for shoulders, which is fantastic. They kick out and up, which is brilliant. There is obviously an upper bicep swivel there as well. There is double jointed elbows, although that bicep does seem to work against it a little bit in terms of its size and width there. And then there is a pin swivel at the wrist. So again, the wrist can rotate 360 degrees, and of course it hinges forwards and backwards as well. Now there is a ball joint in the chest, sort of. It allows the upper body to move from side to side and move forwards and backwards a little bit, but there's not a huge range of motion here in truth. But there is a supporting ab crunch at the waist, which allows the figure to bend forwards and backwards a bit better, but again, not a huge range of motion. There is, of course, a ball joint in the hips, so of course the leg can kick out to the side, it can kick forwards and backwards, and the knees are double jointed to allow the legs to kick right the way back there. There is a swivel at the top of the boot cut, so you can spin that lower leg around 360 degrees if you want, and then there is a ball joint in the ankle, allowing the foot to arc forwards and backwards, but also hinge from side to side. In terms of extras, he does come with an extra pair of hands. This very cool third hand, which is essentially a moulded hand holding his grappling gun, which actually has a working string, so you can actually, I suppose, tie that to something and have him swing if you want, which is pretty cool, bit different. And then a couple of batarangs as well. Have to say, really quite like this grappling gun effect. It's very different, a bit experimental, and I'm all for that. I think it's pretty fun, pretty cool. And I think the batarangs are very nicely sculpted, and he has no problems holding them. And in fact, he can hold them between his fingers, which is a very nice touch. So this looks really authentic and very nicely done. For the sake of scale comparison, here he is standing next to the DC Universe version of Batman from Mattel. As you can see, there is a slight height discrepancy here. He's a little bit shorter, a little bit it's narrower in frame. And then here he is against one of the McFarlane offerings, this one being the Year 2 version of Batman. As you can see, there's a monstrous gap between scale between these two figures. Okay, and moving on to the Batgirl. Now, the Batgirl was one of the few special deluxe releases in this line. She's numbered at number 23. And she's deluxe, of course, because she has her motorcycle, which is very cool. But again, the same branding, consistent with what we saw with Batman, except this time we have sort of a purple colour wrapping it around, of course, to match her costume. And then finally on the reverse, highlighting the other deluxe release in this line, which was, of course, the Dark Side. Now, the figure itself enjoys the same articulation scheme as we saw with Batman, has all the same basic points of articulation, but obviously the frame of the figure is a lot narrower and thinner, and is considerably brighter. This version of the costume for this character is obviously a lot more colourful because it is meant to be the Batgirl of Burnside, which was a reimagined version of Batgirl's costume, which was introduced later in the New 52 run. And this is, of course, obviously a nod to the 1960s costume. Now, it's not my favourite look. Obviously, the 1960s show was very campy, deliberately so. So for me, this isn't my preferred look for Batgirl. I much prefer her original look, and I really liked the New 52 imagining of that look when it was first brought back. I thought that was a really cool update, but nevertheless, I still think this is a really nice figure. The sculpting looks to be pretty authentic. We've got that sort of enigmatic smile on her face there, which definitely captures the spirit of the character, and I think it's been very nicely painted. There's lots of different paint apps, particularly around the eyes, which are very carefully applied there. There's no smudging, and it all looks pretty solid. As we can see, the sculpting of the costume is very nicely applied. There's lots of little zips and things. This time the bat emblem actually is sculpted in, very nicely painted, looks bright, colourful, and I think they've done a pretty good job of this. Now, it is missing a little bit of paint apps when it comes to the utility belt. That is obviously just moulded into that one plastic, which is a shame. If it just had a wash over it, would have enhanced it, but nevertheless, very nice figure all in all. The cape is a lot shorter. Again, it's a very flexible rubber, which is nice. Again, nicely painted. Not too much you can do with it. You can't really pose it per se. She does come with two versions of the cape. This is obviously the resting cape, and then of course there is the riding cape. She also comes with quite a few cool little extras as well, including 2 extra pairs of hands, which is great, and her phone, grappling gun, and best of all, a windswept riding cape and windswept head. I should point out that one of her extra hands is moulded specifically to hold the grappling gun. Her finger does go right onto the trigger there. This looks absolutely perfect. I love this. But I have to say, the star of the show is definitely the bike. It comes with this wonderful display base, which is meant to be a bit of road, and there's some puddles being splashed into an action effect there, but these very neatly hold the bike in place. And there's some absolutely lovely attention to detail here, both in the bike sculpt, and we can see the tyre there, we can see the tyre tracks, which is fantastic. They're coated with a wonderful white wash again to make it look like it's been driving through some dirt, which is fantastic. But even the base itself has a lot of detail on that cracked road. We can see those puddles again, nice different washes running through that. There's brown, there's white. It looks really authentic, and it genuinely looks like it has caught a moment in time. And I have to say, I think they've done an absolutely tremendous job of the sculpting and painting of this vehicle. It looks absolutely tremendous. The sculpting is fantastic. This looks like a real bike. There's a lot of little details on here which make it look swish and fantastic, but also very authentic as well, which is brilliant. It's a wonderful sculpt. I think they've done a really nice eye-catching design. It looks really good, and then it's just wonderfully painted as well. The paint applications here are magnificent. It has this wonderful metallic sort of purple sheen to it, so it really catches the light lovely, and it just looks really nice. It's also functional, of course, so it will move forwards and backwards with those wheels there, which is nicely done. Now, in terms of steering, there's a little bit, not a lot, but you can just about control which direction the bike is going to roll in if you want to, which is pretty decent. And then when we apply the extra head and the cape, creating that dynamic windswept motion is absolutely brilliant. I think it looks wonderful. It genuinely looks like we've caught a moment in time here. There's a whole sense of dynamism and movement to this figure when it's not even moving. I think they've done an absolutely amazing job with this. Definitely to be commended. This is easily one of the best figure and bike sets I've ever seen, and I love that you can tilt it from side to side as well, just giving you a couple of different options for posing, which is just fantastic. So there you have it. There's a couple of fantastic releases from this DC Icons line. In hindsight, I do really feel that this line was somewhat short-changed because I think they were offering something new and interesting here. And perhaps it deserves something of a retrospective, a review, if you will, of these figures, because I think they had some hidden depths that maybe weren't given the attention they deserved first time around. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.